our clients who we manage the aircraft for, they rely on us for that. And definitely the charter customers, they're absolutely expecting the operator to take care of that from them. So we're not getting calls from corporate risk departments asking.
Correct.
It's up to us.
Correct. So Eddie, let me ask you this question. What do we need to look at when we're going to an FBO in terms of security? What safeguards have you, as a major FBO chain, put in place to protect our assets, our people, our equipment?
People talk about ISBA certification and safety first and what have you. Those are all guidelines and best practices. I think what one has to look for is, first of all, some of those certifications, which at least gives the operator a certain level of comfort to say that these people have some procedures in place to safeguard my aircraft. But more importantly, I think it's just for the pilot and the crew to observe what's happening around the aircraft and how the ground handler is actually looking after the aircraft. Are they putting the tow bar on correctly, for example? So observation by the crew is good feedback for the operator. What we do is we train and train and train.
So we were talking about this yesterday, that we have one provider on the stage with us, Osprey, who's taking a slightly different approach to the traditional way of doing things. And you mentioned it was more of a data-driven model. Can you explain what you're doing?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I think for us, we identified that there's a real problem. There's a glaring error and glaring gap in the traditional methods of risk management, of understanding risk, of risk assessment, largely because the main components of that risk assessment, the identification of a threat or a hazard, the assessment of the likelihood that that threat or hazard will impact our operation, and the assessment of the impact of that threat or hazard, all of those are being conducted by a human being. Now, human beings have, of course, great strengths in areas of assessment, but we are all inherently biased by our background, our education, our culture, and I think if we are relying on the vast majority of our risk assessment procedures to be conducted by an inherently biased human being, then we've got a major problem in how we're doing that risk assessment. And also, we're using risk assessment methodologies that were developed decades, if not more, ago, in a world where the use of data is an everyday occurrence in modern technologies. So I think utilizing and integrating the power of cutting-edge technology, computing power, and data with the specific skills and strengths that a human being can provide in a risk assessment process is where we can really shift risk management, risk assessment to another level. And by data-led approach, what I mean is cutting through that bias, that inherent perception or misperception of what the risks might be in a particular area by using the data to really drive our understanding. And if I may, I'll give one specific example, which is very relevant to civil aviation. We've seen over the last 3 or 4 months the escalation of the situation in Saudi Arabia and Iran. And the perception is across the industry that the threat to civil aviation now is higher than it has been for a long time. But actually, if you look at the data, the threat to civil aviation was arguably higher last year than it is now. Yes, we've seen an escalation in incidents, but the incidents we've seen growing are largely UAV incidents, whereas last year it was very much dominated by ballistic missiles. Now, the shooting down of ballistic missiles requires a conventional surface-to-air missile system by the Saudi Arabians. Now, that poses a significant threat to civil aviation, much more so than the air-to-air engagements that have been used to counter the drone activity this year. So if you look at the number of the uses of conventional surface-to-air missile systems last year compared to this year, it's significantly higher. And it's the data that allows us to cut through that perception that the situation has got worse for civil aviation.
How do you combat the perspective that the customer has based on not having that data, based on only knowing what they believe to be true? How do we overcome that stigma and get them to trust what the data is actually telling them?
Well, it's only by use of data that we can do that, because that is the joy of data, is that it is much more black and white than, again, a human analyst. The opinion of a human analyst is, as I said, inherently biased, but the data can, in very black and white terms, show that a risk is present or a threat is present in a particular area. That incident happened in that location at that time, full stop, end of story. That's not the same as a human saying, I think there's a risk here because I've looked at a number of different sources and I think there's a risk there. There's a real difference there, and it's the data that allows us to give clients, customers, passengers the confidence that actually we're being very specific and accurate about our risk assessment processes.
But how do you suppose that, just as an example, operators or ground handlers share that information? Because I can't think of too many operators or ground handlers that actually want to share their risks in their environment. That's a challenge that I think general aviation has.
Yeah, it is a real challenge, Eddie. I think not just general aviation, I think it's across the whole of the aviation industry and across many industries. You know, sharing data, we're all concerned, rightfully so, about sharing data, particularly if it might give competitors a commercial advantage over our organization. And this is very much the case across the aviation industry. But I think collaboration is the greatest risk management tool that we have, full stop. If we work together, we can take risk management procedures, take our consideration of risks really to another level. And there are ways of doing that using modern technology. Multi-party encryption techniques can give these parties 100% confidence that the only people who will see their specific data are themselves. The insights, the industry, cross-industry benchmarking, the analytics, yes, they can be shared across the industry, but they're not picking out individual operators, but they're still giving the benefit of that sharing of data to the broader industry and allowing us to really step up our risk management processes.
I agree with you, but there has to be also differentiation between commercial flights and private GA flights.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, as we said before, different risks, different environments, different operating models, and what incidents that are prevalent in the commercial world are very different from incidents that might be prevalent in the GA world. And again, it's the data that allows us to identify those differences and make sure we're focusing on the right thing in our risk assessment processes.
No, I agree with you, but we've got to get everyone on board.
Nicola, let me ask you a question. As a large operator, how do you prepare? Do you do a risk analysis or a risk assessment before each flight or only certain flights?
I think it really depends. We obviously do a feasibility analysis to see if we can do the trip. We do a lot of ops in Africa because we have owners and charter customers who do a lot of flying in Africa. So in those cases, we're looking at security pretty heavily. The tools that we have, we need because nobody can know what's happening in 25, 30 different countries at any one time. And even within the crew themselves, I mean, you can have a U.S. pilot who has a very different view of risk versus, let's say, a Russian pilot. So the tools come into play there because ultimately, in the end, the crew have to take the aircraft and fly it somewhere. So they have to be convinced that we're doing the right things, and we have to be convinced too, as the operator, that we're doing the right things from a safety perspective, and that's ultimately where the tools will help us analyze the trips and make the right decision.
Mark, do you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to say, the data can show historicals, but it can't necessarily predict how a city or a country or anybody's going to react to a certain situation, a political instability, a weather phenomena, that type of things. And an analyst can help be able to predict and provide suggestions and present options to be able to mitigate that risk.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's absolutely right. And that's why I was talking about the requirement for the integration between the technology and the human being. That human being plays a vitally important part in a risk assessment process. A human being can still do deep, intuitive analysis that a computer can't do. But a human being can't look at 200,000 sources of data every 15 minutes in 65 different languages. It's just physically impossible to do that. So combining those two strengths and two powers is where we get the real joy of risk management.
Not to mention the cost of having somebody that can speak every language around the world to be able to analyze that data to begin with.
Or a team big enough to do it. Yeah, exactly.
How much influence does culture have, specifically when we take the data out and we're talking about a subjective risk analysis or risk, someone's writing a report based on a location or an area of overflight. How much does culture play into that? Mark, I'll start with you on that.
Are we talking about the culture of the crew, the culture of the location, destination? What are we talking about?
Are the risk reports, the risk analysis, culturally biased?
The risk reports themselves, not necessarily, but some people see things through rose-colored glasses and can see a threat in a particular location to be nothing. I mean, for example, you have a customer who's based out of a high-threat location, a risk 4 location or risk 5 location, traveling to a risk 3 location. There can be inherent threats at the location that they don't necessarily see as a big deal. And definitely culture plays a part in that type of thing. It goes back to sometimes crews have rose-colored glasses and only see what they want to see.
How do we, as providers of solutions in this arena, not sell fear? Does that make sense? How, there's a trend, there's a tendency for service providers to say, well, you need our service because this is happening or this is happening. How do we stay completely objective and not sell fear? And that's a follow-up question based on the cultural bias of the operator. Because let's say we're going to Central Africa. Central Africa could be acceptable risk to many customers, most customers, and it can be extremely unacceptable to others. How do we make sure that we're selling and promoting objective information and not subjective scare tactics to the industry and to our customers?
I'll take that. Again, and I sound a bit like a broken record, but I do think it's all about the data. It's the data that allows us to be objective about it. And I don't think, I mean, at the end of the day, whatever we do, it still sits on the operators, your shoulders to make the decision about whether to go somewhere. We can provide support and data and information that helps you to make that decision, helps you to make an informed decision, and helps you to make a decision based on accurate data that allows you to be very specific about the mitigating measures that you might want to put in place for a particular operation. And I think taking the subjectivity, the emotional aspect of a human being out of it, and using that data to drive the risk assessment, the risk management process, allows us to be far more objective and not to sell fear, because that's absolutely what we don't want to be doing. In fact, if you look at the perception of security and risk management across the industry and across many industries, across all industries, historically it has on occasions been seen as a blocker, as a hurdle that needs to be overcome, or a box that needs to be ticked in order to carry on and become commercially successful and do your business. We need to change that conversation, and we can only do that if we're using objective risk management processes, because risk assessment should be a business enabler. It should be an inherent part of every decision that we make as an organization.
I understand what you're saying, but having operated some FBOs in Africa, myself, and having been vice president for Africa, I understand the African market quite well, and you brought that subject up in terms of deepest, darkest Central Africa. What we need to rely on as ground handlers, even though we don't have an FBO in a certain location, we rely on agents on the ground. So we get our information from the agent, and we have to rely on human input for that. So the ground handler or FBO is the source of information for operators, even though we may not be located at a place where they are going. We may have an agent there. So that's important for operators to understand, that their preferred FBO may know something about a location that we are not present in.
Also, I think it's important that you look at who the passenger is, the possible threat against that passenger, and the inherent threat at the location that the person's traveling as well. I mean, those all are a factor that I think contribute to the overall risk assessment, risk management of the operation itself. It's not just about the data. It's also about who the person is who's traveling, and the threat against even the company that's involved.
So you're saying there's no one size fits all
No,
solution
sure not.
for risk management?
No.
I mean, I can give you a great example of people's differing view on risk. When earlier this year, when Venezuela was having a lot of disruption, most people would say, steer clear of Venezuela. A lot of our Russian clients saw a good business opportunity. We started getting a lot of requests to go there. And ultimately, it was up to us as the operator to assess that and decide if we were going to go. So you have clients who would never go, and then you have clients who say, that's a great business opportunity. The purpose of the aircraft is a business tool to get them there to get the opportunity. And we're the operator that is hired to make it happen.
Okay, so let's say Elite Avia is going to fly that flight to Caracas in the middle of the turmoil during the protests and the street riots. And let's say ETI has the FBO there. You own the FBO or you manage the FBO in Caracas. What precautions should we as the operator make with you, and what precautions should we make with our ground service security provider, Mark? It's a two-part question. So I want to hear from the FBO side. What can we do? Can we ask you to step up security? Can we ask you to perform things differently?
I think you must see the FBO and the ground handler as an extension of all the services that you can think of. So think of a hotel and think of the services you can get from a hotel. The same thing applies to FBO. So FBO can organize security. You can organize a haircut if you need to. So yes, we can do. And you have to rely on the FBO there to make to provide you with the best possible solution. So it's important for you to understand who the FBO are, who the subcontractors are, so that you can do some mitigation of risk by understanding that. So yes, we can provide all that.
Okay. And Mark, from a service provider standpoint?
The risk that's directly associated with the operation of the crew would depend on obviously what's currently going on in that particular location. If we're talking about threats downtown because of rioting and protests, you keep the crew close to the airport and you provide security trained drivers or executive protection as needed to ensure the safety of that crew.
How do we get granular data? We look at, we typically as operators and in this industry, we see reports, and those reports are country specific. Earlier this week, you would have seen a report from Mexico. It would have been a high threat level, but really the threat was in Culiacan. And the threat in San Pedro in Monterrey was nil. How do we get that data at a small set, street level, if you will?
Well, you use data, first of all, to be able to help predict that type of thing. But you also have to use some type of analyst to be able to determine where those threats are and be specific about the cities. I mean, as you mentioned, you can have a country rated 5 on the 1 to 5 risk analysis spectrum, but the city itself be a 3. And so you have to take those individually and make the assessment based on where they're going and what's happening in that current location.
Yeah, I think it is key to understand how much data is available in open source and how much is available to, if you know where to look and you know how to gather it and you've got the capacity or the technology to be able to gather that data. It is amazing. It's phenomenal how much data is available out there on, that indicates threats and risks to aviation, right down to street level. You get crime statistics at street level on many cities in the US and other areas around the world. You can get, using social media exploitation, you can understand where protest activity is happening, where social unrest is occurring around the world, because a lot of that communication is done through Twitter or through other social media platforms. So it is amazing how much data and how much information you can get, and the granularity, that level of detail that you can gain if you are able to look over that broad spectrum of data sources. I think there is one other point that is to be made, and Etty, you made it before, I think, about the variety of sources that you need to look at. I mean, I think it's important for any operator that a single source of data is never going to be sufficient to conduct a proper risk management process. You need to gain as much information about your operation as possible, and that might be from your people on the ground, your agents on the ground. It might be from other crew who've flown to that location before, as well as your government, your regulating bodies, and third-party providers, that can provide that sort of level of data and analysis on any particular operation. So that breadth of sources is exceedingly important.
Is there such thing as a low-risk airport or a low-risk location?
Just repeat the question.
Is there such thing as a low-risk airport or a low-risk location?
I think there is. You mentioned some before. You mentioned going into Chad, for example, when there's civil unrest. It's an unsafe area.
No, but a low risk.
But a low risk, I think there are. There's many Western airports are low risk, but there's always going to be a risk of sorts.
I think you need to define the
what is low risk
in more detail. So, and I think this is one of the issues that's been with traditional risk management processes is necessarily because of the limited capacity of a human being. You've had to lump a whole pile of different risks into one number, word, letter, whatever it is that high, extreme. You've lumped all these different types of risks into one descriptor, and when you're looking at any airport around the world, you can't do that. I mean, you look at what it traditionally might be considered low-risk airports. You've got Santiago, Chile. You've got Hong Kong. You've got airports that are considered low risk, and yet there have been recently, just in the last couple of months, significant events that have had a massive impact on aviation. And it doesn't mean to say, the aircraft's going to get damaged or people are going to get shot or anything like that, but it does mean there's a massive impact on aviation due to social unrest, due to protest activity, and so you can say it's a low risk from being shot or petty crime, but it's a high risk for social unrest. So you need to define that risk in detail to be able to work out that airport.
You can have.
Well, I think it's worth keeping in mind also that it's not just about flying in and flying out. In the aircraft management business, you have clients who live there, and their expectation is that you're going to build a base there and operate the aircraft from their home base. So we've operated aircraft out of Brazzaville, Congo, and the client's expectation is the aircraft is there, ready and available when they want to go. But you have the issue of crew, changing environment, things are happening, and how do you deal with that? It's a constant sort of looking at the situation and deciding what to do. And it usually, it always falls on the operator. And it falls on the crew, who are the ones on the ground seeing what's happening. And you talk about low-risk airports. I mean, somebody who's spent 1 month in Brazzaville is going to say that Dallas, Texas is low risk. So it depends on what you've done and what you've seen.
You can have a low-risk location, low-risk airport, but the corporation and the person riding in the back could be high risk due to something that's happened in the news, due to a possible plant closure, due to many local factors that could make a threat towards that particular operation. It doesn't always have to be about the physical security at the airport in the city. It's sometimes inherent to the corporation as well.
So now that we've made the decision to go into a place that we've considered an appropriate, we've accepted the risk of going somewhere that might be a little bit higher risk, what do we go and ask the FBO or our handler for to make sure that we are safe?
I must just stop you right there, because you said, how do we stop getting fear into this business? And these questions you're asking is putting more fear into this business. So the question you have to ask the operator again is just give me all the information you have in terms of the airfield itself. Are there any obstructions? Are there any, is any unrest in the area? So all these questions can be answered by the local FBO. I guess it's also up to the individual FBO to let the clients know if there is a considered risk in the area or at the airport. So I think you have to rely on your service provider to provide you that information, as opposed to you asking what the risk is.
Well, to play devil's advocate for a little bit, will the FBO or the handler always give you the information? There's an example a couple years ago in Cabo San Lucas. Everyone was pushing to go to this Cabo San Lucas airport instead of the other airport, Mike Sierra Delta. And come to find out, it was because of a tax benefit issue where the handlers on the ground got better remuneration for sending airplanes to that airport. There's no fence at Cabo San Lucas. There wasn't even a fence to protect the aircraft from the town. Can we rely, or is that just a solution? Do we need to just find trusted partners to make sure we get good information?
Well, I'd like to think that your example is an isolated one.
I hope so.
Yeah. From experience, I think that everybody that I know in this business is serious about safety and security. So it's very, very seldom that I see people punting something that can cause risk.
I think it's probably worth going back to my point about collaboration as well. I think one of the greatest untapped sources of information that the industry has is its crew. You know, there are hundreds of thousands of members of crew flying all over the world every single day. And the first aircraft that flew into that airport, the crew should have probably said, yeah, you don't want to be coming here. And if there was a way of getting that information out to the rest of the industry,
Twitter.
Twitter, exactly, then all of a sudden you very quickly solve that issue. And again, I think we can only do that by collaborating better.
I agree, and I believe there are some platforms. You have, MBAA, IOC, you have Ops Group, you have others. Are there any other platforms that you've seen in the security and risk mitigation fields where people are sharing information openly? Is there anything that anyone watching this could point themselves to as a best practice for sharing information?
Sadly, I don't think there is at the moment. I think there are. It's a very fragmented sort of capability. There are a number of different communications channels that different groups of people use, whether it be email distribution lists or WhatsApp groups or other platforms as well. But I don't think there's yet an established industry standard for sharing that sort of information, which I think is a shame. And I think efforts should be made to do that.
I think there's probably a lot more collaboration with a group like As Is, who's dealing with corporate security, than there is on the aviation side. I think there's definitely a lack of support and focus on the aviation security and risk mitigation upon aviation itself.
Andrew, why did Osprey decide to look at the in-flight security? Because you're doing something very unique and it's very interesting. What made you take a look at that where others haven't done that in the past?
I mean, I suppose the birth of Osprey really came after the MH17 disaster, and the outcry in the industry about how the information about risks in flight was not being shared, was not known across the industry, and resulted in such a tragedy as that, when almost 300 people lost their lives. And I think that understanding that there was a real requirement for the whole industry to understand what those risks and threats are in airspace was really where we started. Of course, there were attempts to do it. ICAO tried to do the CZIR, the Conflict Zone Information Repository. Unfortunately, didn't work. Great initiative, but didn't work because of the political challenges that governments face in reporting on threats over their own airspace, and the hesitation politically and diplomatically that governments have to do that. And that's, I think, where private organizations have a real benefit, because they don't have those political biases, they don't have those political limitations or diplomatic restrictions on what they do. We can share information, whatever information we want. It's all unclassified. We have no issues of classification or diplomatic restrictions. And I think that provides a great value to the industry that other organizations might not have.
Mark, you arrange security and you deal with a lot of vendors around the globe. What are you looking for in terms of an FBO or handler to make you comfortable with your selection?
Well, once again, you got to make a risk assessment, and you have to talk to those particular FBOs. You have to get a feel for what type of security they're using, perimeter fencing, lighting, parking area, camera coverage. All those things are a definite factor in choosing an FBO or a supplier.
How many operators do you think actually do risk assessments on their alternate or diversion airports?
I'm not sure.
Well, I know we do. It's really hard to say, and it really depends on where the operator operates. Our operation is Africa, Europe, Asia, Russia, some really difficult places, and I think it really depends on, as an operator, if you're, let's say, based in the U.S. and you're flying around the U.S., your sort of risk analysis is probably less than somebody who's operating out of some other place in the world that is a little bit more risky. So I think it depends.
How does a flight department who's experiencing some sort of in-flight emergency and has to divert, how do they get that intelligence when they're in the air? Let's assume they have data link or something, or it's that phone or something. Who do they call? Do they call an Osprey? Do they call a security service provider? What do they do?
Well, unfortunately, I think most of those decisions are being made currently on economics. It's going to be the closest location. If it's a weather diversion, you're going to go to the closest location that you can possibly go to that's out of the weather threat. I don't think there's many situations where the actual airport has been assessed in order to be able to decide whether to operate into that particular facility or not. I think it's mostly a matter of economics.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Mark. But I think there's the problem. There should be an aspect. I mean, really, there must be an aspect of risk assessment when you're looking at diverts, whether that's prior to the flight happening and being preemptive about your risk management processes, or whether it's something that has to be done instantaneously. I mean, again, using technology, that the capability is there to give an up-to-date risk assessment of an airport at a second's notice. Our platform does it. You can get that up-to-date information. You can get that data instantaneously that allows you to make that decision, combined with the other aspects, of course. You need to think of the commercial aspects of it. You need to think of who you've got in the back of the aircraft. You need to think of the sort of diplomatic and political side in terms of how do you get the aircraft in and out. I mean, if you've suddenly got to divert and you end up, your options are, you're in a US aircraft and your options are Iran, you're going to be stuck there for ages, as operators have seen. And it can cause you a real problem. So understanding that risk and the level of risk that your particular operation might face at a second's notice is perfectly feasible, and more operators should be doing it, I think.
And I think that applies to not only diversions, but also to choosing an ETP, equal time points. I mean, that kind of stuff isn't looked at, I don't believe, at this point. You're looking at the closest possible location that can act as an ETP rather than what's happening and the threat evolved for that particular airport, because it's mostly fuel-based.
No, I would agree with you. I would say the industry has a serious problem with picking the same ETP airports, flying across the pond regardless of the weather conditions or how much snow or the lack of medical care if it is a true medical emergency or diversion.
But then you go back to your very first point, Ryan, integrated risk management. If you're looking at not only the commercial aspects, not only the weather aspects, your fuel, your logistics, but you're also looking at your security and your safety and your medical risk management, you've got to do it in an integrated fashion, because that's the way you really understand the situation that you're going into.
Has that data, all this data you're collecting, has it thrown any red herrings? Has it painted anything improperly?
The answer is it could do if you didn't know how to look at that data in the right way. And again, this is a vitally important role that the human being plays. We've all heard fake news. We've all heard circular reporting, single source reporting, which can throw up red herrings, as you say, in particular data sets. But again, that's why we have a very capable analyst team, because we need that human oversight to be able to quality control how that data looks and to make sure we're not falling into those traps of circular reporting or fake news. But also there are issues around, an incident happened, and of course, when an incident happens, people talk about it more, and therefore there's more reporting, there's more data out there because more people are talking about it. But again, if you understand that and you can take that into account in your analysis, then it actually makes a more powerful data set. Anyway.
When does a flight department engage the service provider, the security service provider? At what point of the planning process? Nick, when do you guys involve the third party or the outside provider?
Well, all the time. Based on the flights that we're doing, we're always checking just to see what's happening, where we're going, what we're doing. Obviously, some flights we've done more than others. So anything that's new, let's say, we'll definitely spend more time looking at it just to see, based on if it's a new location we've never been to, we're spending more time on it than if it's flying into Moscow for the 10th time that week. It just depends on where you're going and sort of who's involved in terms of who's in the back of the aircraft, because that can change. I mean, if you have sort of VIPs in the sense of diplomatic government representatives in the back of the aircraft, things can be a lot different than if it's let's say a business person that's going in there. So it really depends on who's in the back, where you're going, who are the crew, a bunch of factors.
So what we often get requested is to place one of our ground handlers at a location where we don't have an FBO, simply to supervise the handling. Again, because the risk assessment hasn't been done or is unknown in certain location, they ask us to reposition some of our ground staff to handle the aircraft there. And we often do that in certain parts of the world.
A lot of it is also the crew. We had a situation where we had a technical issue and we had to land, and it was in Angola. So the crew, they got the aircraft on the ground, but we were AOG and we had to wait for parts. Well, they ended up sleeping in the aircraft for 3 days because they were concerned that somebody would come and tear a piece off the aircraft, because that's what happens. So you're relying a lot on the crew because they're the ones on the ground who have to face any issues that come up. So there's a huge human element to this once you actually get into the trip.
Would everyone agree that it's important for the crews and the clients to provide their feedback post-flight back to the security providers, to challenge any data that they receive that could be questionable, or to reaffirm the data that they received in their briefings, or to provide any other color or information? Would we agree that that's a vital step that most of the time, not most of the time, but many of the time, is forgotten?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and I think that is one of the most vital steps in any risk management process, is that feedback loop to understand whether what you've done and what you looked at and what you predicted and what you thought was going on in that situation was right, and if it wasn't, why wasn't it? What sources of information were you tapping into that gave you a false picture of that environment? And the only way you can do that is by that feedback loop, again, from that untapped source of information, the crew that are going to be on the ground that see it face to face, and they experienced it. And I think that's an absolutely vital part of a good risk management process.
But back to your point, that will only be shared within the operator. It's not going to be shared amongst the operators because it's an advantage.
I can tell you one feedback loop that works really well: the crew and the hotel and what they think of it.
Well, everyone, I think we're good. Thank you, everyone, for being part of the panel, and I wish everyone a successful rest of the show, and thank you all.
Thank you.